everybody. Thank you so much for being on with us today. Happy Tuesday, the second day of our Fall University Express semester. I'm Katie Earle. I oversee the University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're here with Anna VanDien, who's a licensed clinical social worker, and we'll learn about her in a second. But before I introduce you to her more, we'll go over some quick housekeeping things because we have quite a few new folks on with us today. As you've heard me say, we are recording this session, and I will try to get it on our website by the end of the week, and that'll be at erie.gov/University Express. You are muted and without your video showing, and it's not because you've done anything wrong. Those are just the settings for our class today. So we'll be communicating with you through our Q&A panel. So if you're on a computer, look at the lower right-hand side of your screen. You'll see a little box with a question mark that opens up your Q&A panel. And then if you're on a tablet or smartphone, if you touch your screen, that brings up your control panel at the bottom. See that little button with 3 dots, and there you'll find your Q&A. So type in questions and comments when you think of them, and then we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have today at the end of the presentation. So quick shout out to our sponsors, which is my Department of Senior Services, Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And if you ever need anything, start with Senior Services. You're looking for benefits, something to do, nutrition, give us a call. We're at 858-8526, and we are on with a really wonderful community partner that we hope you all take advantage of if you need it and spread the word about their really wonderful services. So let me introduce the star of our show to you. Anna VanDien is the coordinator of the Wilson Support Center. The Wilson Support Center provides grief support and education that is sensitive, compassionate, and responsive to the needs of the Western New York community. Information and resources are available to individuals experiencing grief and loss, and services are provided by licensed healthcare professionals and peer volunteers. I'm sure she'll tell us more about this program. In her role as the coordinator, Anna is responsible for triaging and personalizing grief support, supporting staff development, and fostering community relationships through education and trainings such as these. She has former experience as a hospice social worker and dementia care advocate, and I'm just so excited to have you back, Anna. So thank you. I'll turn it over.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's always so wonderful to be able to present for University Express. My name is Anna VanDien, as Katie mentioned, and I'm happy to be here with you all this morning. Our plan for today is to talk about this idea of an evolving understanding of grief, because it's not something that is static. It is something that has changed over time. So I am going to give a brief introduction of the Wilson Support Center. I will also do a brief primer on grief and loss, but I really encourage you to go back to past recordings. I think it was specifically 2021 in the spring, where I did a more expanded presentation on grief and loss and the services that we provide. But the meat today is really going to be focused on kind of a more academic look at grief and loss, the way that there have been grief theories throughout time and how that has matched what we see in our world. This theme is really coming from the most recent idea of diagnosing grief, and the proponents and the opponents of this change that happened just earlier this year. So that is where we're headed. I am going to just briefly share some of our contact information so that you have that on the screen. I will share it again at the end while I'm taking any questions or comments, so that again you have an opportunity to write that down. This is the best way to get in touch with us. This is our main line and our main email address, where we accept all referrals from community partners, where we receive requests from all of our community members. So the Wilson Support Center is a grief and loss support center that's available to the community, regardless of the type of loss or the experience of loss. We typically provide support groups, though there's still a pesky asterisk there because our groups have remained paused. So in the meantime, we have built a really robust database to capture the support groups that are related to grief in our community, and even national offerings that may focus on some more specific experiences of loss, and offer a virtual opportunity to connect. We offer a lot of counseling referrals as well. We know how burdensome it is to even get in with a counselor, let alone a counselor that has a good understanding of grief and feels competent to counsel folks in that. So we can never recommend one counselor, but we do vet our database to make sure that these are providers who are reputable in the grief space. So those are referrals that are available, and we even highlight the providers who participate with certain insurance providers, again, just trying to prioritize your time and your calls. We have historically a number of youth programs to support young families, and we do a lot of resource linkage throughout the community, such as the Department of Senior Services, to make sure that those other pieces of your life that unfortunately don't pause during grief, to make sure that they also get the support that they need. We have a lot of printed literature, supportive handouts that we can mail out, email out, so that sometimes having something to read or something to reference over time can be helpful. Maybe you're trying to talk to a friend about their grief, or support a friend in their grief, and that can be a nice kind of gentle touch to make sure that they know you're thinking of them. And then, as Katie mentioned, informational presentations like this, which I offer to the public, as well as other healthcare organizations, to make sure that our healthcare teams in Western New York are grief aware. Now, you may be familiar with the Wilson Support Center because we also deliver the hospice bereavement benefit. So the Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo, we are an affiliate of, and the bereavement team is housed within our center. And through that benefit, after a hospice patient dies, their circle of support is able to access individual counseling, support groups, and a correspondence program for 13 months after that death. People are able to access that at any point in those 13 months. And right now, all of our services are being offered remotely, so it's been very convenient for people to access care and to utilize as much of that 13 months as they need. All right, so we, of course, can't start any of these conversations without agreeing on what grief is. And the way that I like to introduce this is by first acknowledging that grief is something that can be really difficult to talk about in the broader society. Grief is most often thought of following a death, but we know that there are a lot of different types of loss that can instigate grief responses. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is the idea of a relationship loss. This can be any sort of breakdown within a relationship in some way. So it could be a friendship ending, it could be an estrangement or a breakup, divorce. It could be death, but this specifically calls out the relationship within that and the meaning that is derived. There's also the idea of losing an aspect of yourself. So feeling like you are more aware that you've lost yourself or who you are. And this could be something physical, like a disability. It could be an event, a traumatic event, perhaps domestic violence or sexual assault. It could be just some sort of health news. I'm thinking of some younger couples with infertility, perhaps a change in health as you age. Certainly diabetes changes a lifestyle, news of cancer, a kidney diagnosis, all of those can be pretty life-changing, but especially to that identity that you have for yourself and the lifestyle that you hold. Financial status can also be a big part of that, whether it comes with the loss of a job or just kind of a change of circumstance. So that can accompany a lot of different experiences of grief as well. Developmental losses are those losses that occur just across the lifespan and are considered pretty normative. However, we don't usually talk about them in the context of grief. Unless you're in the grief world, then we very much understand. So this is the idea of kids starting to go to preschool, starting to go to school, and that difficult transition. And then into teenagers, trying to form their own identity and kind of losing that childhood that they had, perhaps taking on more freedom, but also taking on more responsibilities. And then leaving home perhaps, or going to a job, and that transition, getting married, having children, becoming a caregiver to an elderly parent. So all of those things are developmental in our lives, and really seen as the steps within our decades. But there are experiences of loss and of grief within that should not be avoided, or they should be acknowledged. Finally, we have the loss of a treasured object. And this can sometimes be stigmatized in a way, because objects maybe shouldn't, sometimes society views objects shouldn't have this value over our life, but they do. There's a symbolic significance in the objects that we hold dear, and that should be honored. Especially when there is that connection, perhaps that object is the connection to someone that has died, to someone that we've lost, or to that relationship that has changed. So that object, that treasured object, could be a home, perhaps, right? Your first home, or maybe your dream home, or maybe that home where you were finally able to be independent. And to have to move from there can be a very difficult transition. And then just belongings. We all carry things with us that mean something, and to not have them, I mean, think about just losing it for a couple of days, right? The ones that we truly treasure, we can really have a strong reaction to, an emotional reaction, if they're lost for good. So we often think of grief as following a primary event, but there are ripple effects from that primary event. So I like to use the metaphor of a drop of rain going into a pond, or a rock going into a pond. That drop or that rock hitting the pond is that primary event. And the secondary losses, as are outlined here, are those ripple effects. They also have impact, and they also exist, and they also need to be acknowledged, often just as much as that primary event. So if you think about a move, perhaps, how do these secondary losses, how do they create ripple effects after a move? For the loss of faith, often that can follow something like a death, where the whole world has been shaken up so significantly that, of course, it's also going to impact the way that we view the world. And that could change our faith. It could be strengthened, or it could feel like a crisis. Loss of identity, loss of routine, loss of safety, the loss of purpose, and self-confidence. I think about caregivers most frequently with those, feeling like they have all this time all of a sudden, and that alertness and awareness that they had for someone else, they now struggle to apply back to themselves, to take care of themselves, and to foster their own hopes and dreams, because perhaps the hopes and dreams that they had with that person who has died has been lost. Grief is an experience that is not just emotional, though that is what we usually think of first and foremost, right? That shock and numbness, sadness and guilt, sometimes anger, irritability from feeling so overwhelmed. That is all very normal, and those fluctuations are normal for much longer than I think anyone anticipates or expects. But there are also a lot of other changes that happen. If we think of our body as one closed system, our emotions are going to have an impact on the rest of us too. And our grief will have an impact on the rest of us too. So cognitively or mentally, there will be changes, however small or big. Sometimes people feel like they're so overwhelmed, they can't think straight. They can't think the way that they used to. They might have some difficulty finding words. They may have some difficulty with short-term memory loss. And those are things that should definitely be checked out by a doctor. but they are very normal, especially in those immediate days following a death or a major significant loss. So not to be ignored. There are also physical responses that should be checked out by a doctor. Often, if you've been caregiving for someone who has died, or if part of the loss you're experiencing is a prolonged experience of chronic illness, getting some physical checkups from your doctor is really important to make sure that you are also taken care of. That said, it's very typical that people hold grief physically in their bodies. It could be tension through headaches, through GI symptoms. It could be anxiety with breathing, with heart palpitations. And so all of those things should be acknowledged and seen through that grief lens. But again, I can never overstate the importance of checking anything physical first with medical doctor. Socially, we see people's lives change a lot in grief. They may tend to withdraw either because it's just too much energy to go out. We're already feeling very diminished in grief, and that's just too much. Or sometimes our social supports don't quite respond in the way that we had hoped. They maybe aren't able to provide the support that we need. And so we may not seek out the same support from the people who are in our lives before, and we may try to add to that social support and seek out more connection, such as a support group. And finally, there's our spiritual element to grief as well. And that speaks to that idea of questioning the world after we question someone's death. So that crisis of faith or a renewed sense of strong faith. But the way that we view the world will undoubtedly be changed. Okay, so this gets us into the idea of the lenses that we understand grief through. So I'm going to outline different ways that those theories, those perceptions have changed over time. And I think what you'll see is that previously, and about 100 plus years ago, grief was really viewed as something that was pathological or problematic. It was something that needed to be really focused on in order to let go, to seek closure. You'll see words like recovery and healing. We still see some of those, but really where we are moving is to normalize grief, because it is something that all of us will experience. It's something that happens at any point in life, and it at least happens to us once, if not multiple times. So we want to instead seek out this message of adaptation, of feeling that you have the tools at your disposal to adapt to a changed life. So instead, we acknowledge that there are a variety of losses, just as I did a few moments ago. We focus on that adjustment, that there are transitions throughout life. Life is never the same day to day. It's not a static thing, it's always evolving. And so we integrate these changes that are often very unwelcome and very painful over time to integrate that into what a new life looks like. And through that time and through those months and years, sometimes we really seek to make meaning from what has happened to us. And we use stories and memories to help us do that. Through this presentation, I think you're going to see that just recently, this year, we may be headed back towards the middle or closer perhaps to the problematic view of grief. There's still a lot that we'll have to wait and see with some of these ramifications, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I just kind of wanted to put that on your radar to listen for as we go through these together. So as I'm starting to share some theories with you, I want to just highlight that all of these theories describe grief as a very necessary process following a loss. So it is something that is expected. And even that, I think if we could get our whole society on board that that's something that is expected and natural, we'd be in a better place. I also want to acknowledge as I'm sharing these theories that a lot of these theories are coming from white people and mainly men. And so there is a very specific lens that a lot of these grief theories are posited through. They don't consider a lot of the other more varied cultural expressions of grief and varied cultural experiences or understandings of grief. Though I think that there are some theories that start to open the door for those to be more fully shared and appreciated. So we're going to walk through the timeline of these theories, and we'll start with Freud. Freud first coined this idea of grief through using the word mourning. And generally, we think of mourning as the physical expression of one's grief. So, grief is something that happens inside, and the mourning is that physical expression. And he also, on one side of the coin, talks about mourning, which is that necessary experience after a loss. And then on the other side of the coin, he talks about melancholia. And that is something closer to what we would call depression today. But his idea of mourning can really be captured in this phrase. Mourning comes to a decisive end when the subject severs its emotional attachment to the lost one and reinvests that free energy in a new object. So generally what he's getting at here is that we have an attachment to something that we lose or someone that we lose. And once that person or object is no longer there, what are we going to do with that emotional attachment, that investment? It has to be applied elsewhere. Now, I hope that the terms used here strike you as very academic because they are. I know that it can feel kind of cold. But again, these are academic theories and not always, especially back in these beginning phases of grief theories, we are very much viewing it through that clinical lens. Through time, Freud started to go back on this position, on this view, after he had experienced, unfortunately, the death of his daughter and some other losses in his life. So I think that also helps to inform just how opinionated these lenses can sometimes be, especially at the beginning where we're just trying to get something on paper, get something started. But the idea of grief as we know it is really formed on an attachment theory, which was established in through the 60s and 70s by Bowlby and Parks. So the original theory was that parents and children attach to each other through their years of bonding, and that's really important in the child-parent relationship for learning, and for that child then to establish their own relationships later on in life. And certainly if there were any threats to that attachment, depending on different attachment styles, the relationships in the future for that child may look one way or another. So that was really Bowlby's initial theory, but then Colin Murray Parks comes in and says, well, that's exactly what grief are these meaningful attachments that then are lost. And that there's distress and an emotional disturbance that comes from that. So they really view grief through what we would call a human development lens, something that is natural to our development to connect with one another, and then to have that grief experience after losing that attachment, that bond. This continues to be some of the most influential research on grief and the research that we see today. Now, right around that same time, in that same decade, Dr. Kubler-Ross established her 5 stages of grief. And this is a body of work that is largely misunderstood, I think, by the larger society. for whatever reason, it's something that has really stuck in our society's mind. And I mean, it's great to hear people talking about grief, period. But to only include this model can be a little bit limiting because, again, it's just one way of viewing grief. Some interesting information just to share about Dr. Kubler-Ross's work is that she actually was studying grief of dying patients. They had never been told that they were dying, but they knew. And so she did qualitative research to discover their experiences and to take note on how they felt, what their thoughts were like. And so the 5 stages of grief are actually based off of that. Of course, now they are most of the time applied to those circles of support that are left behind after someone dies. And they very much resonate with many people. And I think that alone is helpful to be able to name what it is that you're going through. There were initially a lot of opponents to this idea of grief happening in a phased model. But Dr. Kubler-Ross has written in her books that it was never intended to be 5 stages that you go through and check off and then move to the next one. Grief just doesn't happen in those neat, tiny boxes. And the reality is that you may experience all of these, you may experience one, but you'll probably go back and forth over time. It's never something that's complete. So again, this was when we just started to consider that there's more than one way to respond to grief, and with opponents coming, or I should say critics coming out and noting some concerns about her work, or at least the way that they had read about it. That helped us to then move towards something a little more inclusive decades later, unfortunately, but the idea of continuing bonds. So this is much more culturally appropriate. It really acknowledges that unlike what Freud said, where you just move that emotional bond to something else, that emotional bond is still there, and your love and the history that you have with them, the memories that you have with that person continue on, and that's okay. This isn't something that should be pathologized where because someone continues to wear their father's sweatshirt, that's a problem. It may just help that child to feel connected, to feel close again with their parent. So this is the idea of continuing bonds, again, butting up against that idea of letting go, instead really encouraging activities like ritual to find ways to continue to express that love and to feel close to their loved ones. So a lot of examples can be found in more of the contemporary, I'm thinking of like some of the contemporary funeral home offerings. So I know a lot of people will be cremated these days, and their loved ones can really put those ashes in anything. Sometimes in jewelry, sometimes in an urn that they keep in their home. Sometimes there is a small altar or a room dedicated to that. And all of that is much more attuned to the cultural experiences where there is a routine of continuing to go back to that object, that bond, to honor everything that was taught by that person, the lessons, all of the memories, and all the people that loved them. So it's really a beautiful expression of legacy. And a lot of the cultures that were already, doing this for centuries before, were really highlighted in this research. So Mexico has Dia de los Muertos, and they also highlighted the Japanese rituals of paying homage to their ancestors and welcoming them into their lives to bring blessings. So this was a pretty big change from where the grief space was previously. just a few days or a few years later, the dual process model was highlighted as well. And this is a very practical outline of what the grief experience, what a healthy grief experience can look like. So to explain this model a little bit, you see the large oval is that everyday life experience, living with grief after someone has died or after a major loss. And within that, these researchers divided restoration-oriented tasks and loss-oriented tasks. And the real key here is the oscillation between the two, which could happen, multiple times throughout the day, 1 hour to the next. But the idea being that, of course, there are loss-oriented tasks and emotional experiences that need to be acknowledged and allowed to be expressed in that experience in those days after. But also you need to give yourself a break. You need those positive distractions. You need to do something for yourself, and you need to eventually, find a way to reintegrate into life. And that can take some time. That can take a lot of time. But to start to find ways to just baby step into that. And so the key being, if you oscillate between the two, then you are actively engaged in a healthy manner with your grief. What they say the risks are is that either people spend too much time on those loss-oriented pieces. So we think about someone who isn't getting out of the house, who is crying all day, maybe looking through a photo album constantly, refusing to talk about anything other than their person, that really avoiding the life around them, the real changes that have taken place and the impact of that, or denying even that person is gone permanently. So that can be really dangerous. And then there's also the risk of spending too much time in the restoration-oriented side. So not really acknowledging that the loss has ever happened. So you just go on as if nothing has changed. And you aren't letting yourself cry or feel angry or express your guilt. Whatever those emotions that are coming up are instead suppressed. And you just move forward, denying or avoiding that grief. And so that is also very dangerous in the fact that in both of these cases, that prolonged experience of grief can be possible. Not only on the loss-oriented side, because that's all they're doing, but also on the restoration side, because eventually all of that has been denied and avoided is going to catch up, but not within your control. And it can be a lot harder then to manage what is coming up for that person. So this was and continues to be a very practical guide for people who may feel like they can't do anything right. They're doing one thing or they're doing the other, and actually that experience of oscillation is very healthy. I also wanted to mention this theory of shattered assumptions, because it's something that is a little more abstract and sometimes not always included in the grief space, but absolutely applied. And it is based on the idea that as humans, typically we have this view of ourselves and the world, that for the most part, we are safe, we are capable, and we are in control. However, true or not, but that's generally the way that we operate on any given day. We also all have three negative or fears, negative beliefs or fears, and that is that we are incompetent. So the fear of being incompetent, the fear of being unlovable, and the fear of being unworthy. And by worthy, they mean deserving of good things. So When there is an experience of trauma, which could be a death or a very significant loss, that reality is really challenged. And all of those assumptions that we had about the world and about ourselves are now shattered. And we're left to really look at all of the pieces that lay around us and wonder how does this all fit together anymore? And so those are often the phrases that I hear from clients. And so this is a theory that I like to bring up, because again, it just normalizes that experience for people. You're not the only one going through this, but your journey will look different than someone else's. So that assumptive world is something that you seek to put back together, but it will look different. And there's a lot of counseling support to help do that, but it takes time. Okay, so this brings us to the present day, with the controversy of diagnosing grief. I'm going to share the path to this. It was March of this year. So we start off just by sharing a little bit of background, and I just want to share a couple of these terms so that you have an idea of what it is that I'm talking about in case you're not familiar. So we often work with what's called the DSM, and that is a diagnostic manual used by the American Psychiatric Association. They're on their 5th version, which was released in 2013. And then there's the ICD-11, and that is basically the classification of diseases that physicians and other healthcare providers across the world use so that we have a standardized idea of diagnosing folks with these illnesses that obviously have no boundaries. And they're on their 11th version, which was just released in 2019. So those are really the governing bodies that determine whether a new diagnosis or a diagnosis is maybe changed. It could be just the name, it could be the criteria, the classification. I will share that at the Wilson Support Center, we don't do any diagnosing. Again, the only folks that we're seeing for grief counseling are through the Hospice Bereavement program. And because that's already covered through insurances, through the hospice benefit, we don't have to diagnose in order to see our clients. But plenty of counselors do. And that's part of why this is so important. All right, so this path really started in 1995. And the goal here was to differentiate grief and depression, because some researchers were finding that they were two different things. Their work was indicating that the measures that were in place were unfortunately measuring kind of an intersection of the two, but not doing a good job of identifying what was very different between grief and the experience of depression. So they had come up with the phrase bereavement-related depression. But something over and above those symptoms was also identified. When they saw an experience of continued dysfunction, they named that complicated grief. And from that, they developed an inventory of complicated grief. So that inventory highlights the specific experiences that people would say yes or no to determine if they have that experience of complicated grief. In 97, they used that inventory of complicated grief to just develop a diagnostic criteria for pathological grief. So this wasn't something that was approved. It was just kind of a preliminary step. The inventory for complicated grief really didn't provide clinicians with the ability to determine treatment plans. It just kind of said, okay, this person has complicated grief. Well, now what? What are the indications? How do I change the way that I'm caring for this person based off of that new information? So they used that diagnostic criteria then to form complicated grief disorder. That's what they ended up naming it. And this was assessed 1 year after a loss. So 1 year after someone experienced a major loss, there was just constant assessing to see how things were going, but there wouldn't be any sort of assignment of a disorder until 1 year after. We jump forward a bit, about 10 years, and there was a major bereavement study published, and this tested that criteria for the idea of pathological grief or disordered grief. You'll see that a lot of similar words are used, but they are different, and they all kind of have different meanings now. We've had to parse all through them. So I'm using the words that each study used, and I apologize for any confusion, but just trying to get the major takeaways here to understand that evolution. So some of the characteristics of this study was that primarily the people that were involved were white widowed people, and they lived in Connecticut. So it's a pretty limited sample, but they have since tested that with other samples across the globe, and through that produced a pretty specific criteria set for prolonged grief disorder. So this is the first time that we see those words put together, which I'll refer to as PGD from this point. They state that this accurately and reliably identified bereaved subjects who are at heightened risk of enduring distress and dysfunction. In 2010, that diagnostic manual for psychiatrists, they held a conference specifically to talk about trauma and stress-related disorders. And so that's when they combined that Yale bereavement study from Connecticut with other international studies on bereavement, and they proposed that this PGD diagnosis should be included in the DSM as well as the ICD. Ultimately, the DSM at this conference decided that they weren't going to move forward with finalizing it. They were going to list it as an emerging diagnosis and just continue to discuss it and study it, and instead filed it under persistent complex bereavement disorder. The ICD-11, however, held their own conference on stress disorders, and they did recognize PGD as what they called a mental disorder. In 2019, the DSM said, okay, we need to harmonize, we need to align essentially our criteria with the ICD-11. So to do that, they took more data from Taiwan, the Netherlands, Turkey, and the UK to paint a broader picture that really helped to support that these initial studies in Connecticut were actually representative across the globe. In 2020, just remember what was happening in 2020 from April 6th to May 20th. They did hold a public commentary period, and this was held online where people could submit, anyone could submit concern related to pathologizing normal grief, and that was what came from those submissions. Namely, people were most concerned about this criteria, including only a 6-month evaluation period. So instead, they decided that for the PGD diagnosis, they would extend it to 12 months. And they did decide to include it in the DSM-5. So there was a text revision. They didn't release the whole version again for a DSM-6. They just revised the text. However, when we see this PGD be announced in March of 2022, this is basically how it is outlined. So it is a persistent form of intense grief that must be present nearly every day of the last month for at least occurring 6 months following the death. And so these are some of those symptoms that could be expressed during the last month that they're measuring. It could include emotional numbness, detachment from others, and disengagement from the environment, loss of meaning and purpose, feeling quote unquote stuck in their grief, unsure of their own identity. Often the phrase that they use here is feeling like a part of them is missing. Denial of the loss or difficulty accepting reality. And they really highlight yearning or pining for the deceased. This was one of those criteria that they found to really highlight a different experience with grief and with this prolonged experience of grief. So the proponents behind this diagnosis are really trying to identify the experiences that they're seeing anecdotally in some of their clients. When they talk about the impact, they generally say that this diagnosis would fit about 10%, anywhere from 10 to 15% of clients seeing counselors, billing their insurances for counselors. And so having an actual diagnosis that represents their experience can improve their access to therapeutic services, because otherwise at a certain point, a counselor doesn't have a diagnosis, a reason to tell the insurance company why they're still seeing this client and thus billing for services. So the proponents state that this helps to, or will help. We still have yet to see for any of this. It's still so new and fresh. But the hope is that it helps to really care for the most vulnerable cases, whether the death was sudden or unexpected, whether the death was violent. Certainly the death of a young person, we know, tends to be much more wide. The experience of grief can be much more widespread, not just focused on, one or two people. And then a prior mental health history. They also say that this can limit any confusion otherwise held between grief and depression. And as I mentioned, they state that it's only expected to apply to a small population. And there is a heightened risk for people who are in bereavement, a heightened risk of suicidal ideation. So that's where some of the serious concern lies with that small population who are experiencing just a prolonged experience of pain. And it opens the door for further therapeutic study. So they do talk about some targeted approaches as far as interventions for counselors to focus on, for psychiatrists to focus on. The idea that not only can we study therapeutic interventions, but we can also study what medications may be helpful to people. So you can see here that we're kind of coming full circle in a way, or moving the needle back to where we started with Freud. The idea that this is something that needs to be named. Now, whether we're going all the way back to Freud or whether we're just finding a new understanding of this remains to be seen. And there has been a lot of pushback to this. First and foremost, opponents state that this just pathologizes a natural process. So just as all of those comments online in 2020 highlighted, this is something that's supposed to be acknowledged by our society in a more widespread manner. And certainly the 6 months is not only anecdotally, but culturally problematic. How can, a counselor of one culture then have a client of a different culture and pass any sort of diagnosis or judgment, as it may be seen, on their experience after losing a loved one. They're also concerned that in the most vulnerable cases that the proponents list, that actually those experiences, because they are more or can be more distressing for a longer period of time, that would be considered normal. It's not disordered. Again, they highlight that this criteria mostly focuses on death-related losses. I shouldn't even say mostly, it does. It specifically states a prerequisite is the death of a loved one. So it doesn't consider those non-death losses. And how is a client helped if they're having that prolonged experience of grief from a loss that was not a death. They also say that, suicidal ideation is not accurately represented in the research. And what they mean by this is that generally, if someone is asked if they want to end their life after losing a loved one, they may say yes, because I just want to be with them. And a lot of it is focused on the desire for a reunion. It's not necessarily someone who has a plan, who knows they have access to means. And so that there is a different process for assessing suicidal ideation in someone who's grieving. And they say that the research just doesn't accurately acknowledge that. And so what those statistics are for increased risk can't be fully trusted. Opponents also say that this decision to include PGD in the manual was made prior to what would otherwise be a very typical process of rigorous research. Basically saying we need to know more before we make this decision. Why was this rushed? And a lot of opponents also share concern about the open door now for pharmaceutical intervention. So not only do we need to focus on therapeutic interventions that can help the grieving population, but we also need to be careful about what we open ourselves up to for pharmaceutical intervention, just throwing meds at people who are grieving, who we feel are responding in a very natural way. So I want to leave enough time today for questions. I'm just going to end quickly with acknowledging that there is some shared ground here. Both proponents and opponents acknowledge that there is a lot of need to focus on cross-cultural examination. So how is grief within races, within ethnicity, genders, how is that informed differently based off of history? How is it expressed differently based off of culture? Not to mention various forms of death. We know that there are different experiences in some communities than others, with different experiences of death, whether natural or a sudden. Relationship to the deceased, and also the ages of who has died and now who is that client sitting in session. Also, the lens of 2020 of COVID-19 undoubtedly helped to push this because of the just overwhelming experiences of grief, whether they were death related or non-death related. And so acknowledging, both sides acknowledge that this has really changed the way that people are impacted by death and how they grieve. And it will continue to have impact on PGD and grief in general, with the risks and the outcomes of what we find. So I will stop there while we have a few minutes for questions, and I welcome any comments as well.
Thank you, Anna, for that wonderful presentation, so comprehensive in such a way that we could understand it and sit with it and then start to digest it. We do have at least one person calling in, so if you just wouldn't mind reading the phone number and then the email address.
Of course, yes. Our number is 716-836-6460. 836-6460. And our email address is griefsupport@palliativecare.org. Palliative care is spelled PALLIATIV as in Victor, E.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm seeing a couple comments in here. Everybody type in what you're thinking. So this first comment I'm seeing is, love that you mentioned the different types of losses, not just people.
Yes, so important. So often overlooked.
Absolutely, especially as we age. I'm seeing, I appreciated learning about the different models.
Great. I'm glad. I think that that's information that all of us can use, because and part of what I maybe didn't state enough was that all of the models may be valid to someone, right? So it's really about what model speaks to you, what model helps you understand your experience of grief. And I think that just sharing a smattering of those can help people be exposed to more information and more ways of looking at it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This I'm seeing after 1.5 years, I'm still running into several memory loss. Is this the norm or should I seek professional help?
Yeah, so we sometimes call those triggers, and they sometimes can be anticipated, and other times are completely unanticipated. So, something like a birthday coming up or the anniversary of their death can certainly be a trigger, and that may be a trigger for years to come. There's certainly nothing abnormal about that. There's a lot that you can do to just try to take care of yourself, in some extra special ways those days or in anticipation of it, maybe the week leading up. Um, and also finding a way, kind of to that point about continuing bonds, to find a way to feel reconnected to that person, whatever that special day is. Um, and then those unanticipated triggers, a song comes on in the middle of the grocery store and it transports you right back to a memory. Um, there's not much you can do about avoiding those things. That's just part of life. And again, something that I would note as completely normal. Um, but again, I think the goal with grief is to allow the feelings to come without feeling, over time, the goal is to not feel so overwhelmed by them, to feel like you can still express them in whatever way is appropriate, in whatever way feels true to you, but then still be able to enjoy whatever it is that you have, later on that day.
Thank- Thanks, Anna. This next thing is my kids have said they like being sad about their grandfather's passing because then they won't forget him. Is this something that may be concerning?
No, I think that as long as they're able to also feel other other feelings in life, it's not just sadness, then I think that that's very normal. I think a lot of people will speak to how they have become grateful. Doesn't mean it's not still painful, but they have become grateful for their grief because it is still a connection to that person. It's still the reminder of who that person was and the time that they spent together, and also the times that have been hard since they've died.
Hmm, that makes a lot of sense. We're coming up on time here. I'm just seeing one more thing. So any other thoughts or comments you want to share, guys, please put it in the chat. This is what would you like to see being researched moving forward?
Mm. I think that from our team's perspective, there is a lot that is highlighted as far as therapeutic interventions, like in a counseling session. Um, there are a lot of there are a lot of interventions, but there's not a lot of rigorous research to really highlight and indicate that they work. We know that they work anecdotally because we have that experience with people, and they're reporting back to us that it has helped them in this way or that way. But to actually have a body of research that supports that, I think would be really helpful. And frankly, would really help to legitimize the help that grief counseling can offer people. I think a lot of people will say, well, how is grief counseling even going to help me? And I don't think that an academic article is always the answer to that. We're not going to just spout off some facts to you. But the more that is made widespread to society, I think makes it that much easier to come in for a grief counseling session, to seek out grief support in general.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. We'll just give it another second here. If anyone has anything that they want to put through. Otherwise, Anna, thank you so much. Oh, thank you. This made me feel more normal.
I will take that. That's a win for me.
Yep. All about normalizing this year.
Yes.
Okay, well, everybody, thank you so much for your time today. I'm seeing awesome presentation. I'm seeing a bunch of thank yous. So again, if all goes as planned, I'll have this posted on our website by the end of the week. There's the information if you need to reach out to the Wilson Support Center. And for our folks on the phone, it's 836-6460 is the phone number. All right, I hope everyone has a really good day. Bye.
Thank you all.